Now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Colleen Lutz Clemens, Associate Professor of Non-Western Literature and Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Kutztown University, earned her Ph.D. in Post-Colonial Literature at Lehigh. Her dissertation focuses on issues of veiling in literature, so she's right in her wheelhouse today, and studies the intersection of women's issues in art and politics. Please help me welcome Colleen Lutz Clemens while we do a quick change.
While we're doing the change, I will empower any of you that are getting live updates from the World Cup game. If you hear that the U.S. scores, feel free to interrupt this and let us know, okay? Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was awesome. Thank you. And as Jason said, I'm back doing pretty much what I went to school for. Last time I was here as Director of Gender Studies, and today I'm here as a post-colonial scholar. So if you give me a sec, I'll get my talk. So in 2014, I was invited to participate in a college's common reading program by giving a lecture on Malala Yousafzai's book, I Am Malala. And I took Malala everywhere I went with that summer. I took her to the beach, I took her to coffee shops, I took her to doctor's offices, my daughter's ballet class, and the cover is hard to miss. Her bright pink scarf, her eyes looking right at the viewer. People commented on the book when they saw it, and as most people who follow the news at least know a little something of this young girl's story. So I start this talk with sharing two stories of interactions, both with smart women who are readers and friends of mine. In the first story, I am sitting in a coffee shop in my town when a friend runs into me. She sees Malala smiling up from the table. My friend begins to gush about how much she appreciated the book, having read it all in a few days. She felt grateful for how much she learned about Afghanistan from reading it. The second story begins at the kitchen table of one of my tutoring clients. The mother is hovering, nervous about her daughter's upcoming SAT test. The mother sees Malala and begins to remind her daughter, remember her? She was the girl in Afghanistan that the Taliban shot. The daughter nods her head. Does anybody know what's wrong in those stories? It's okay if you don't. So Malala's from Pakistan, not Afghanistan. So I do not recount these stories to disparage my friends, who are smart women who took the time to read that whole book. They are well-informed and deeply care about women's issues around the world. And yet, even they had been lulled by the narrative that there is one essential version of the woman in the Muslim world, that all women from those regions have the same experience, and that they are powerless without the intercession of some element from the West. Books that replicate these narratives are popular to the reading public in the West, and I use that term very carefully because of its slippery nature, but for today we'll just say the West and talk about here. This talk examines the phenomena of what I term phoenix narratives that are deployed to continually replicate this essentialist notion of women in the East, so the East being areas like in South Asia. Phoenix narratives are the stories of young girls and women that have been beaten, tortured, oppressed at the hands of misogynistic structures and who have risen out of the ashes of their suffering to find liberation. Perhaps the most famous of these narratives is Malala Yousafzai's, yet we'll also talk about Mukhtar Mai's In the Name of Honor, and you don't have to have read either of them. It is an important predecessor to Yousafzai's memoir. So an essentialist notion is an idea that generalizes and limits at the same time. It is the idea that there is an essence, a one-size-fits-all identity for a group. For example, when one hears someone say, if women were rulers of the world, there would be no war, one is hearing essentialism at work. The idea behind this quote is that women are naturally not inclined to violence, that women are only soft and peaceful, and when they are not, there must be a reason to explain why they are against their natural inclinations. Essentialist narratives are all around us, and we must unyoke ourselves from the powerful hold of these essentialist narratives that hold us all in and that have the power to make people feel abnormal or lesser. These narratives, or something Chinua Achebe calls comforting myths, must be deconstructed and readers must work to create narratives that recognize diversity and the unique experience of those around us in the world. Essentialism is the force that allows two very smart women who have spent considerable time thinking about Malala to conflate her with women in Afghanistan, even though Malala's story takes place in Pakistan, a country very different from Afghanistan. Do women in these countries share similar structural struggles? Yes. Does the United States have complicated geopolitical relationships with both? Of course. Comparisons can be made, but conflation, and conflation just kind of means smushing together, conflation of nations and their people is a dangerous game. This talk will ask us closely to consider a few of the moments that contributed to the construction of these two essentialist narratives of women in the East that have overtaken the West's image of women from this region, the veiled woman and the phoenix, a term I give for the genre of memoirs like Yousafzai's that shows a young woman emerging from the destruction wrought by the hands of the Taliban, a group that does not represent the majority of Muslims in the world. Scholar Edward Said argues in the original Intro to Orientalism that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively. So this talk works towards Said's original project of deconstructing these Orientalist narratives in order to understand how now, in the 21st century, a single narrow narrative of women in the Muslim world continues to be misconstructed, the impact of re-Orientalism on those women, and the use, and often misuse, of these narratives within political discussions. So it should be no surprise that the narrative that leads to Yousafzai's memoir begins on September 11th, 2001. On that day, my second period honors English class and I watched as planes flew into buildings. A room full of 17-year-olds implored me to make sense of what was happening on the screen, just as I had shepherded them through Hamlet's soliloquies and feminist readings of Jane Eyre. But I had nothing to offer them that day. That moment was too big for all of us. And only now do I think are we starting to make sense of it and our response as a nation to what would become the moment by which many of us would measure our lives. From that morning on, many Americans lived in the post-9/11 world. So my research is really just a small part of a much larger body of work investigating this new world and the ways we speak about each other in it. After September 11th, a trajectory of anti-Islamic sentiment began. Starting with an overt othering of the Muslim faith, the US government, under the purview of George W. Bush, worked to focus attention on the oppression of Islamic women, a progression meant to provide a rationale for eventual military action done in the name of these oppressed women instead of in the name of US interests. Suddenly, names that had never entered the national discourse on a broad scale became household words uttered with a mix of contempt and confusion. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Sunni and Shia. Areas of the world previously known for oil or unrest within their own borders, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, housed an enemy who professed a hatred for all things Western, a hatred about which those outside of academic or governmental circles knew little up until 9/11. As Americans watched a new national department be created overnight, they began to speak about a world that, on September 10th, 2001, was of little interest to them. After the attacks, new images entered the living rooms of millions of Americans. Bearded men in white turbans sat in caves and laughed at the unanticipated success of the attacks of September 11th, while women in light blue burqas wandered dusty streets among ruined buildings. Until that historical moment, many viewers had never considered the global tensions between the East and the West, between nationalist movements and fundamentalist religious factions. September 11th forced the American population out of its ignorance as it witnessed on its soil a tragic manifestation of a problem that certainly was not new to the rest of the world. I witnessed a growing, rampant nationalism I had never seen before. Within days, reports of attacks against Muslims grew to higher numbers than ever before in this country. Anyone who could be mistakenly identified as a Muslim based on traditional garb was in danger, such as Sikh Balbir Godi, who was shot 5 times outside his gas station because his attacker, Frank Roque, assumed Godi's turban meant he was a Muslim. Within the 6-day span after those attacks, the Council on American Islamic Relations received double the number of complaints about harassment than they had received the entire year before. The Council estimated that at the time, 7 million Muslims lived in the United States. Though many of these millions of Muslims denounced the attacks, a fear of the other grew through binary rhetoric. Gender binaries and a Western attachment to female liberation quickly found its signifier in the veil. Once Islam entered the U.S.'s national discourse, the veil became a powerful symbol of women's oppression under the Taliban and in the East. Images of veiled women ran on television, and many public officials evoked the image to rationalize the war against terror. Freeing women living under the veil became a rallying cry to justify invasions to change the ideology of nations. As former President Bush stated days after 9/11, quote, "This is the world's fight. This is the civilization's fight. This is the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom." The assumption of this rhetoric is that women living in countries where veiling is practiced were not allowed this type of freedom. To Americans, the veil became a signifier that signified all the perceived negative aspects of Islamic cultures: patriarchy, lack of freedom of expression, tyranny, and fundamentalism. Much academic work has been done to illustrate this purposeful construction and misreading of veiling. Now we, in the West, must unpack this powerful signifier and show its complexity, its meanings shaped by nationalist state dictates, governmental laws, women's desires, and anti-nationalist movements. If we are ever going to change the national discourse surrounding women in the East, a topic clearly of interest to Western readers based on the popularity of these books. So as I remind all my students, and I remind all of us here, there is, in fact, no one essential veil. No singular meaning of what it means when a woman places a hijab, a burqa, a niqab, or any other covering on her body. Hence, when I discuss this issue, I use the term veiling to dismantle the limiting idea that there is a single essential entity such as the veil, and to acknowledge the dynamic nature of this signifier. So Said, again, succinctly reminds us in his preface that he wrote after 9/11 that the worst aspect of this essentializing stuff is that human suffering in all its density and pain is spirited away. The focus on veiling in discussions of women in the Islamic world became the cornerstone of the construction of the essential notion of the woman in those regions. So in American popular culture, literature attempting to show Islamic oppression of women is de rigueur. In his talk, Translating for Bigots, Adam Talib argues that the cover of books from the East, particularly those about women, share a reliance on essentialist discourse in the West. He says, quote, "The books that are doing quite well commercially, like the ones I'm talking about today, often present themselves to the reader in a specific way. There is still an exotic, orientalizing marketing technique. You're tapping into a popular news and political discourse around a part of the world that is going to affect even literary translations. Veiling is often deployed as a rhetorical device on the cover of books with female protagonists in the East, written for a Western audience." So I'm just going to scroll through some book covers, And then there'll be a slide where they're all together, and I'd like us to talk about some similarities that you see. So these are not obscure books, right? These are books that were on shelves, people were reading, and people were talking about. I didn't dig into like some academic vault. I threw this movie in. Okay, so there's all the ones that I just showed. So I would like to hear from all of you. So what are some things you notice when I put these all together? These were all popular books, and that's what this talk is about, right? This idea of Muslim women in popular American rhetoric. So what are some things you notice? So a somber aura, right, around each of the covers. So they're all looking down, except Marjane Satrapi, but she's a comic, right? So that's a little safer to not have that like passive looking down. Anything else? Decent?
Submission is the word that comes to mind.
Yes, submission is a great word that comes to mind. Anything else you notice? I mean, that's what we're looking for, right? So when we start to see these all put together, we can see what Talib is talking about. This real, they're all kind of facing away. They're small. They're covered. So this is something you don't notice when you're walking through Barnes & Noble, but now when you see them all together, you maybe start to notice this essentialist idea that publishers are relying on about Muslim women. So we talked about Marjane Satrapi. Her look of defiance is there, but it's small. That's this one here. The cover of Kabul Beauty School, which is here, advertises that an American woman, quote, goes behind the veil. In fact, what she does is go to Kabul to teach hairdressing, but the title intimates that she infiltrated some dark secret world where Americans never really want to go. The author of Reading Lolita in Tehran, has anybody read that book? It's good. I wrote part of my dissertation on it. So anyway, she, Azar Nafisi, has even been criticized by fellow Iranian writers of going too far in her depiction of women in Iran and lofting an easy target to Republicans who wanted more fuel for their military fire. She denounces any of these accusations, but she hasn't been able to shake the stigma branded on her by her fellow writers. The images of women on these covers works toward creating that essential notion of the veil, as if all women in some kind of covering are all the same and require outside forces to liberate them. So those in the West who are on a crusade, I'm using the language of George Bush when he was discussing the war on terror, often construct themselves as the savior of women. In The Terror Dream, Susan Faludi argues that Americans, quote, were also enlisted in a symbolic war at home, a war to repair and restore a national myth. So if the myth of America is a place where women are safe and free, and I will argue that it is not, if you want to, later, there must be another side to the binary in which women who live under the enemy must be covered and lacking in all freedoms. In these cases, the West, us, uses the trope of the veil as a means of constantly replicating its belief in the dominance of its ideologies, specifically those of freedom and democracy. Mehdi Yaginoglu, who writes extensively about this, I included just this quote, "The desire to unveil women should not be simply as an uncovering of their bodies, but as a reinscription for the discourse of unveiling, is no less incorporated in the existential or embodied being of Oriental women than the discourse of veiling." So while in the West, the idea of unveiling is equated with freedom, Yaginoglu urges caution in simplifying this act. I would argue that the West has a vested interest in maintaining the idea that women who veil do it under duress and suffer greatly because of it. Thereby, in Western discourse, those who work to save the women will, quote, be greeted as liberators. And just to remind us all about how that conversation went, in an interview with National Public Radio in February 2002, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld exploited this essentialist narrative of women in the East and talked about the ways in which the U.S. in a short time was able to free the Afghani women of the burqa. So in this interview, and this longer version of this paper looks at Laura Bush's rhetoric, looks at George Bush's rhetoric, looks at a whole bunch of people. I'm not just picking on Rumsfeld here, but it's the shortest one. So women have stopped being repressed within a 6-month period of time. So women have stopped being repressed. They can actually walk out in the street and not have their entire faces and bodies covered by burqas. They can laugh on the street. They can go to a doctor, which they couldn't do. They can go to school, which they couldn't do. Historically, we know many of these victories were short-lived, and women continue to struggle against structural oppression. But of most importance to this argument is Rumsfeld using women's rights as a sign of improvement in a country, an issue and a population about which his administration had very little interest months before. So this notion of liberation, of freeing women, forces readers and scholars to consider a second essentialist character born out of text popular in the decades following September 11, 2001. And this is something that in my study I've decided to call the Phoenix narrative. Among Anglophone readership, the Phoenix narrative genre came to enjoy success in the academic community and among a public reading audience. So before Malala, there was Mukhtar Mai. She was also from Pakistan, where she lived without access to the same privileges that Malala enjoyed. Mai's 2006 memoir, so very close to the 9/11 attacks, In the Name of Honor, tells of her desire to die after being gang raped as retribution for her younger brother flirting with a girl from another tribe. But instead, Mai comes to fight Pakistan's laws about rape and sues the government. Mai's story would easily have been lost if it were not for the attention paid to it by her and New York Times paid to it and to her by New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof. You probably have read some of his pieces in the Times. In his preface to the book, he concludes his introduction to Mai and his readers. He writes, quote, "I think you will find a story that is tremendously inspiring, rather than one that tells of brutality and despair. By the alchemy of her courage and stubbornness, Mukhtar has taken a sordid tale of gang rape and turned it into something heartwarming and hopeful." So Kristof has to make the case to readers that while what they are going to read, a quote, sordid tale of structural violence enacted on Mai physically by tribals and physically by and psychically by national politics, is part of the story, the reader will leave the text feeling hope with a warm heart. Mai's rise out of the ashes, so to speak, inscribes her text with a feeling of do-goodery, common in texts telling the stories of women forced to the brink of extinction by patriarchal family, tribal, cultural, and governmental structures. So there are a bunch of these, but probably the most recent and perhaps the one with the most cultural currency of these books that fall into this genre is Malala's story. These two texts contribute to the constructed image of women in the Muslim world. Mai's text is mediated through a Western journalist that found the story of the young girl and wanted it to be heard. This element of assistance gives a clear indication that the audience for Mai's text is a Western one. And of course, the fact that the books are written in English originally illustrates that though both women are Pakistani, their audience is the Anglophone world. There is nothing inherently wrong with this being the audience. Yet these Phoenix narratives enjoy a strong currency in the West and are of less interest in the native regions of the authors. These narratives make Western readers feel better about our own systems, our own treatment of women, and our own military engagements done in the name of these women. The covers of these Phoenix narratives utilize the veiled woman trope that we just talked about, but in a different way. The Phoenix cover plays on imagery with which the West has become familiar in the year since 9/11. But in the case of these Phoenix narratives, we see the actual subject of the text on the cover, not just some stock image of Eastern women huddling passively. Also, Mai and Yousafzai engage a more direct gaze in their covers. Let's see if this is a book. Mai's cover may be seen as a bridge between the desire for the defeated woman trope, as is evident in the previously discussed book covers, and the emergence of these phoenix narratives out of the Muslim world. Her look is not direct, so if we go back to Mai. So we just go back to Mai for a second. So her cover is this bridge between the defeated woman trope and then these phoenix narratives out of the Muslim world. Her look is not direct, but there is defiance in her face, and readers see her face. Yousafzai looks directly at the viewer, inviting the reader to engage in a partnership between author and reader. So interestingly, and there is a third book that I talk about, it's called I Am Nujude, about a young girl who was sold into marriage. And she is also one of these glamour women. So there's more than just these two, but for today I'm just talking about these two. So it is like a common theme. Interestingly, both Mai and Yousafzai were named Woman of the Year by Glamour magazine. There is something disconcerting about a magazine dedicated to perpetuating in the West the mythology of what a woman should be and using these Pakistani women as their Women of the Year in 2005 and 2013. Both these women deserve to be honored for their work and deserve to be heard. I have no interest in silencing women. Yet this talk's concern is how the women and their stories of survival are being deployed for other purposes that conflict with these women's messages, such as putting Yousafzai in front of a L'Oreal banner or using Mai to sell fashion magazines. When their stories are used for other purposes, readers and consumers must be concerned for the girls and women themselves and hope that they are not being used in the same way that the, quote, veiled women of the Muslim world were used as objects of Orientalism, instead of being seen as agents of change in need of allies and partners, not in need of saviors. Phoenix narratives do allow the Western reader some satisfaction. Consider why the story of Yousafzai captured the world's attention. A smart, young, spunky girl who used her mind and her body to fight the most fearsome boogeyman in the US's collective imagination, the Taliban. But is this satisfaction really the end goal of Yousafzai's work? I would argue that Yousafzai does not want Western readers to be satisfied and applauding ourselves. Yousafzai argues for action, not satisfaction. As she stated in her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, I dedicate the Nobel Peace Prize money to the Malala Fund to help give girls quality education everywhere, anywhere in the world, and to raise their voices. The first place this funding will go to is where my heart is, to build schools in Pakistan. At that point, she had not been allowed back in the country, especially in my home of Swat and Shanghala. In my own village, there is still no secondary school for girls, and it is my wish and my commitment and now my challenge to build one so that my friends and my sisters can go there to school and get quality education and to get this opportunity to fulfill their dreams. So here, she is surely looking to create a community of allies in her fight for gender equity, instead of creating a phoenix narrative that one may read and not even remember the correct geographic setting, and then discard the story that has ended happily. Yousafzai demands action beyond a, quote, heartwarming text. Hers a narrative arc that only begins at the book's final pages, as the reader should turn to allyship and activism upon completion of the text. In 2014, Texas artist Anat Ronan's mural, Yes You Can, depicting Yousafzai in the pose of Rosie the Riveter, shows the conflict between the desire for a heartwarming phoenix narrative and the truth of structural oppression enacted on women's bodies and psyches. Rosie the Riveter was an amalgamation of women. There is no one exact person that was Rosie per se. Yousafzai is a person, a young woman, recovering from a devastating attack and exiled with her family from the country she loves. Conflating Malala and Rosie signals that the world is asking way too much of Yousafzai. To be literally conflated with an icon of war is much to ask of an individual. For remember, the goal of this paper is to undo the essentialism that is replicated by these essentialist narratives of the veil and phoenix. Readers should remember that Rosie the Riveter and the women her image inspired were tossed aside and out of factories as soon as the war was over, and the country no longer needed women to work in industry. I do not want to see the same thing done with Yousafzai and her story. She should not be tossed aside when she and her story are no longer serving the West's militaristic or nationalistic needs. Perhaps it is good that Yousafzai ends the book in this way. She writes, "When people talk about the way I was shot and what happened, I think it's the story of Malala, a girl shot by the Taliban. I don't feel it's a story about me at all. Part of me cringes every time I read that and feels great sadness for her not identifying her own self with the narrative of her tragedy and recovery. However, this detachment of herself from her story may be the strategy that saves her. For if the West is asking too much of her narrative, for her to be a mythical phoenix instead of a human teenager, then maybe she can preserve herself in this rhetorical process, even if she loses control over the way her readers use her and Mukhtar Mai's narratives." That is the end, and I would love to have some discussion or questions. Do you want to do that, or do you need to mitigate that somehow?
Well,
he's got a microphone. Perfect.
Test 1, 2. We need to use the mic so that the questions are picked up on the video.
Great.
Otherwise, they won't be. So, if you
So
think
you're in
there's any
charge.
chance of there being some back and forth, hang on to your mic until that we move on to the next person. Tip it back towards you. Hold it fairly close. Otherwise, as you can see, it doesn't get picked up. So, who's got a question for Colleen?
That's a lot on a hot day.
It is.
I get it.
It is. Well, I will start with one if no one else will. So, I think Malala was just in the news. Oh, by the way, 0-0 is the score of the soccer game.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right.
Phew!
So,
Let's hope it goes into overtime.
Okay.
We can watch some of it.
let's see if we can find this. The headline here in the Montreal Gazette. Quebec Education Minister says Malala can teach here if guess what? What's the
God.
condition he's putting on that?
She doesn't wear her veil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop it. When did that happen? How did I miss that?
This is dated July 6th. That's yesterday.
Well,
let me
no
just
wonder
read-
I missed that.
Yeah,
All
let me
right.
just read the first three and then...
So this is news, and wow, shocking that I knew the answer to that.
Yeah.
I'm looking for my
Quebec
water.
Education Minister Jean-François Roberge, I hope I didn't butcher that too much.
Sure, that was beautiful.
Said in a tweet Friday that if Pakistan activist Malala Yousafzai wanted to teach in Quebec, it would be an honor. But like in other open and tolerant countries, teachers can't wear religious symbols while they exercise
unbelievable to me.
their functions.
Okay.
Roberge noted that it's the case in France where the two were photographed together. They were taking part in planning meetings to discuss education during the G7 in France this coming August.
You want me to comment on the spot about that? Because there's a lot of... let's think about this for a second. This person has won the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize. And is being told you cannot wear a headscarf. Is literally all of our lives and beliefs so tenuous that a piece of fabric over her head is going to completely deconstruct the idea of, I can't remember the exact words, I think tolerance.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's happening, right? Like, this is no joke. This is not a person who's like no big deal. She won a Nobel Peace Prize and she's being told she cannot wear her headscarf. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that after I read it. I didn't even see that.
Sorry to sneak up on you.
No, that's fantastic. It just proves how timely this topic is. I love it. Thank you for telling me that.
You're welcome. Brian.
Unbelievable. I'm going to be all fired up now about
So
that.
kind of a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Where is a logical place to draw the line, if somebody wants to say teach and wear a big cross or a really loud T-shirt that pronounces, something, I don't know, absurd. Other religions like nuns that wear habits or, or people that, whatever, want to wear real extreme Star Wars gear, et cetera. I mean, I don't know.
Right, you're doing the slippery slope thing. I get it. I get what you're doing. again, I'm just going to circle back to, is everyone's belief system so tenuous that like somebody wearing a cross to teach a class is going to upend their complete belief system, whatever it is. And then if somebody wants to play the slippery slope thing, then they'll go down to like a KKK uniform, right? Well, why can't I teach in a KKK uniform? I mean, obviously that's different than a hijab. It's just different. They're different things. A Star Wars, if somebody wants to take that and do a Star Wars thing, fine. My belief system is not so tenuous that if I'm sitting in Malala Yousafzai's class and she has a hijab on and I'm not Muslim, suddenly my entire belief system is going to crumble because of that piece of fabric. It's just not going to happen. So to me, all that shows is how tenuous everybody's, well, not mine, and probably not yours either, because you wouldn't be here on a Sunday morning, but like your whole world is not going to implode if Malala walked in here with a headscarf on. You're not suddenly going to be converted, and you're going to be capable of knowing what you believe. And you're going to be capable to understand what a Nobel Peace Prize winner believes. To me, that argument is always about like tenuous nature. So for example, I teach yoga, and I listen to chant. I teach with chants. And someone came up to me once and said, I'm Christian. I do not like the music you play. And I said, I don't understand how 45 minutes of hearing this music is upsetting to you. Like, you've been a Christian for 45 years. How is a 45-minute like chant gonna completely upend your whole belief system? So that's where I always circle back to, is we're big kids, right? Like, we can handle it, is what I would argue to that whoever made that proclamation. The slippery slope argument is always interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have to look at every anecdote, because, I mean, you could go the opposite end and, perhaps women would want to teach topless if they were...
Well, I was just going to say, I'm a feminist. Maybe I'll go in and teach topless. Like, nobody's going to do that. No one's going... Like,
until somebody does.
Unless they're trying to get your attention, nobody's going to do that in the name of feminism. They're not doing that in the name of their belief system. They're doing that in the name of like selfishness. I think like that the topless example, because that's immediately what I thought of as well.
A question from Harley, if you just want to pass it back.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm curious, has there ever been a movement to stop men from wearing yarmulkes?
Well, so that's always the argument in France. So this, if you start looking at laws, it becomes really fascinating, right? So in Turkey, women are fighting for the right to wear a headscarf because Ataturk declared that it was a secular nation, and now women are fighting to wear it. In France, there's a law against any kind of covering, and people are that's the argument that always comes up: the yarmulke or the curls, right? Like, so what are you going to do? Make people cut their hair? Where is that line? Right? This is the exact same question. Where is the line where we start? The argument against these laws, and specifically that question, is that ultimately these laws are against Islam and against Muslims, and that's the easiest thing that would be able to, what's the word? Like, not legislate, like when you enact a law. Enforce, right? It would be the easiest thing to enforce, and also gendered, perhaps, because of the hijab. Because nobody's getting this worked up about a yarmulke. Everybody's getting this worked up all over the world about hijab, niqab, burqa, all those things. Nobody's having like huge debates and writing book about the right to wear a yarmulke in Canada. But here we have...
Even though somewhat the reason for doing so is the same, only it's a man that's being required rather than a woman. I
would be very happy to make the argument that those laws are misogynistic, yes, on another day where I had more to think about. But yeah, I mean, again, it's usually, but even somebody brought up nuns, like I don't know, if a nun is going to lecture at that school, is she not allowed to wear her habit? Is that a conversation we're having? I don't know. I'd have to look. I don't know enough about this story to say, and I don't know enough about Canada's laws, and I don't, every country has its own law. And some of it is in the name of theocracy. Some of it is in the name of secularism. And every country legislates this differently. So it's a really complex issue, and the point of this talk is just to think about how complex it is and how we've seemed to not have a complex discussion about it here in the States. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the yarmulke, because that's often what ends up happening is it's about any kind of Muslim person. I love this. I wish my students had this many questions. Yeah.
I think of religion in general as being a divisive force in society. And it would suit me fine if nobody wore any religious messages on them or with them or whatever. But I don't think that's going to happen. That being said, what do you have to say about the role and position of women in these Muslim societies at home? I have experienced or believed that there's been quite some back and forth in Afghanistan and Iran, particularly, that I'm aware of people being able to dress more Western and more, and then being, again, subjected to the full, it doesn't seem to be a clear picture.
It's not.
Anywhere.
Nope.
Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when I was working on this talk, I wanted to be really clear that it was about like rhetoric and the way we talk about religion, right? The way we talk about it. But I'm happy to answer that question that kind of moves away from rhetoric. The immediate thing I thought about when you asked that question is what's happening right now in Afghanistan. And if you've been paying attention, the U.S. has now been negotiating with the Taliban for peace. And the women in that country are furious because their fear is, well, now we have seen a different, it's been almost 20 years, right? There are kids who have grown up in these countries completely after all of these wars. And those kids are like, well, if you cede just back to the Taliban, what is going to happen? So those women feel sold out. You're going to notice a pattern here. In Iran, women participated in the Iranian Revolution. Okay, so before the Iranian Revolution of, I always mix it up, if it's 79, I think it's 79, 78. Was that right? 79, right? Yeah, that's my, yeah. So women, and this is through because I wrote one of my chapters on Iran, so I feel really confident in claiming this, that women were participants in that revolution and then immediately felt as if they had been not given a seat at the table in the revolution that they participated in, and then were forced into these theocratic laws that they did not agree to. So in these movements, in these countries, we're seeing women participating, but then not really getting that seat at the table.
Well, gee, where does that remind you of?
Oh, well, I have a lot of things to say about that. But, right, like, so this is why you said that, and I love you for it. Yeah, but it's a common theme. So in Turkey, if we go back to that example, again, I've written extensively about Turkey, the women there feel like they don't have a voice because they cannot veil. So there, the women's movement is for the right, what they perceive as the right to veil. So every country and every context has this very different understanding of this thing, right? This signifier that we all have something to say about. And so that's why I really like talking about this, because it is such a flashpoint for all these conversations. And then we can branch out to exactly what you just said.
All right. I think, Jim, you had a hand up, and then I'll come back over here.
So I set the goal here a few years ago to get to know the Muslim community a little better, and I ended up making friends with a gentleman named Mohammed Kaku, who's a well-known Muslim in the community. And I've been to the mosque about 5 times. I've been to Iftar, which is the end of the fasting in Ramadan. Of course, they're very devout people. They're just like our fundamentalists, I think, in terms of their commitment to their faith, and I don't really have a problem with that. So I'm a leader with the ACLU, and a couple of years ago we had 4 relatively attractive, middle-aged or younger women come to one of our meetings, all dark-haired, dark-eyed, no head veiling at all, and they were very interested in what ACLU does, and were quite eloquent in their speaking, and I've got to see several of them since then. They're mostly physicians and dentists and community professionals. And so the other data point I want to throw out is I was at an event, maybe some of you were at the Resurrection Church, a community event a year ago, where a lot of us wore headdress to protect the Muslim community women from abuse. And there was a middle-aged woman that got up there wearing headdress, defending it passionately. I mean, she was really committed to it. I wish I could remember what she said, because my wife really has a lot of trouble with it. But I really support her doing whatever she wants to do with her faith. I think it's, we're not going to win by oppressing these people. It's hard for me to believe the next generation is going to follow in. I have a good friend I won't name who has a young child, a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, who's going to preschool in a secular community, even though he's a Muslim, and he knows his daughter, to succeed, needs to be a secular person, which I think is good.
Yeah,
Just some comments.
No, and it reminds me of something that I wanted to kind of amplify here, which there's this brilliant show on Hulu right now called Rami, and it is written by a young Muslim man who lives in Jersey. His parents are from Egypt, and he was raised here. And throughout that series, the women have ongoing conversations about what veiling means to them, when they veil, around whom they veil. It's like kind of that, almost like what you're talking about, that like insider's look almost. So I really recommend that show to kind of complicate what it might be like to be a Muslim woman in America, the decisions that she would have to make, right? The decisions families have to make. And I know kids that wear yarmulkes all the time, or the Sikh turban all the time, and I know that that's, to me, that's a risk too, in many ways. So I love the allyship that you're doing, and I love that everybody donned a hijab in solidarity, right? Even though your belief did not crumble because you did that to help her feel safe.
And coming right over here.
You make the distinction between the mythological and the material. Mm-hmm. And it's my experience that when one culture is trying to accommodate another culture, you are going to have some mythology about the one culture in order to make that transition. Mm-hmm. And my question to you is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what is the outcome you're looking for? Is it a preservation of what you feel is the feminine spirit? Or
No,
is it
I can assert that right away. Go ahead.
Or is it the preservation of the Muslim religion? Those are two different things, and one can be accommodated much more easily in the West than the other.
So I think when you say mythology, the word I would use is narrative, right? So these narratives of women that came right out of 9/11. That's why I spent a little time talking about how nobody really thought about these women, and suddenly they were forced to. So it makes sense that there's going to become one story, right? That does make sense to me. But in her brilliant talk, the danger of a single story, Chimamanda Adichie says, there's no problem with the single story as long as it doesn't become the only story. And that's the project of this talk and the project of my work, is that I understand why that essentialist narrative rose up out of 9/11. I get it and I understand it because everybody's trying to make sense. What I'm trying to do now is say, we're well beyond that. We need to outgrow this essentialist narrative. We can't keep clinging to it. We can't be investing cultural currency in it just to make us feel good. That's my worry, is the way we talk about these women. So my project, I don't think, is to preserve anything. My project is to actually dismantle anything that we've been clinging to and try to have a much more nuanced understanding of a population that is living right next to us. And that that everybody seems to have something to say about what they put on their heads. So I think I don't want to preserve anything, in fact. Does that answer your question?
Partially, yeah.
What didn't I answer? I'll be glad to answer it.
The question I have is there's a distinction between the feminine role and the religious role. And when you roll them up into one thing, and combine them, it seems you have difficulty making that transition from the Muslim world to the Western world. I think the transition is much more readily made from the feminine point of view than it is from the traditional Muslim point of view.
So I think I understand what you're saying. Let me just make sure. So that the traditional role of a woman within some Muslim contemporary contexts is hard to translate to a Western context.
It's easier.
It's harder for them to translate into because the Western context would be perhaps so different.
Harder than religion, the religious transfer. How do you untangle the two of them?
You don't. Why am I being required to untangle my nuanced way I move through the world, right? I don't know. The pulling apart thing is, I guess, what I don't understand. So
I don't either.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know that it's a productive way of moving forward, asking people to pull that apart. Like, well, you get to be Muslim in your domestic space, but then you have to take your hijab off so that you can make other people feel comfortable in the contemporary space. That seems very, I guess I would say the whole point of this is for me to try to work against that notion and let that person move through the world as their complete and nuanced and complex, complicated self.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question.
Coming over to Pat.
I'm not going to do a good job on this because I've got 100 things floating
Awesome.
around, and none of them are very cohesive. But the thought that keeps coming back to me through the entire talk is the fact that we're talking just about women.
Yep.
And it's always about women. In terms of
In this conversation.
the rules of following the rules. And bottom line is, I'm going to make the assumption that there are women who are Muslim who wear whatever they wear because they have been directed to wear that by the man in their life.
Right. Their dad or their family
father,
or
their
their mom. Absolutely.
The whole deal
or their
is-
government in the case of
Yes.
Iran, right? Like I
yes.
do not. That's nothing to. There's no controversy in that.
Right,
statement.
but I can't, I feel that we just get away from that part too much when we think about, or we talk about, oh, everyone just doing their own thing. I am like Joyce. I feel that if there was nothing religious that I had to deal with
Yeah.
every day, I would be very happy. I went to physical therapy a few months ago, and I've got this big, the worker, the professional, big, huge cross around her neck every day. Now, it's my shortcoming, but my feeling was that set something
Set
up
a boundary
between
up between you.
boundary.
Sure.
Yeah, it's my shortcoming, fine, but it's there.
Yeah.
But the whole thing is we just seemed like we just float around this issue all the time. But I'm sorry, guys, but it's always the women that always, they can wear the curls, they don't, I don't know. Somebody's probably telling, their rabbi, their male, is telling them they have to wear those curls. Or maybe it's a choice. I think it's more of a choice with them to some extent, and I could be wrong about that. But women we're always the ones that get told what to do. I was brought up Catholic.
Again, I'm not going to argue with anything you're saying here.
But we had to wear something on our head.
So what you're saying,
to go
right?
into
What
the
you're saying
church.
is that women's bodies seem to have to enact these symbols more often than men's bodies within religion.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
That's
I
one
think
of
if
the
we
many.
just did a chart, we could all agree on that, right? Like
Right.
we could just do a chart and do that. Yeah.
But in saying that, the fact that we just go off la la la, let everybody do their thing, is sort of like there's a lot of women out there that are not doing their
So I
thing.
hope you are not leaving this talk thinking that that is what I'm condoning, because
No.
Okay,
I'm just talking about
because
a very general
Yes.
approach to that.
the kind of
idea.
everybody gets to
Yes.
do what they want, and nobody actually has a
Like you
conversation
wear a crucifix that
about
takes up
why.
your whole body or whatever. All these things, because it does impact on all of our relationships. And I think the hijab, focuses on relationships. I think usually negatively. I think in terms of in our society, I make a real effort at it to smile.
Good. That's great, right?
I really work at this, but I still would be
Because you're
happier
aware of, I think
otherwise.
that's great, right? Because you're aware of that. And you're aware that that
Absolutely.
person has probably also had bad things said to
Absolutely.
them that day based on that thing. Or maybe has even felt unsafe because of that piece of cloth. So I think that's great. There's no easy answer to this. But the one thing I want to remind everybody about the talk I just gave is that my concern is the rhetoric surrounds this, and then we just talk about this, and then we don't actually deal with like the structural issues that Malala Yousafzai actually wants to deal with. And so we all end up talking about this, right? That's why it's not about the veil, rhetoric of veiling, how we talk about this. I think that we get caught up in the West with this conversation so that we don't actually have to deal with the actual structural, you had used a different word, and I'm trying to remember what it was. What was the opposite of material, you said?
Mythological?
No. Did you say the opposite of material was mythological? No, you said some other word. It was good.
Your distinction between the mythological.
Oh, it was mythological. Material. Okay. So when I say structural, that's what I mean. Like the actual kind of forces, political, sociological forces. We never seem to have a conversation about those things, and we never had like in Susan Faludi's book, she talks about how the feminist majority was trying to have meetings with the Bush administration about women in Afghanistan in 2000, and they were continually turned away. And then after September 11, 2001, suddenly they were very interested in that information, and that I hope you leave this talk thinking about how those women were deployed to be used as a reason for something, but then were not actually brought to the table or engaged in the change that was supposedly done in their name. So that's why I want to make a clear distinction, right, about the rhetoric, about how we talk about these women is really important and has deep political implications for all of us and for these women, right, that Malala is calling everybody to be an ally to at the end of her book instead of just to be put away and forgotten.
Come over to Eve, and then we'll go over here.
Yeah, I once was driving down the road, and there was a guy ahead of me in a Mercedes, and he had a hoodie on, and he pulled right in front of me, almost caused an accident, because he had no peripheral vision from wearing a hoodie. Now, I relate this to a German law which prohibits women from wearing a burqa while driving. And I can see that there's some...
That seems like a reasonable law to me.
Seems like a reasonable law,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, most of the countries in Europe are against women wearing veils.
Correct.
Or women driving.
Well, that's true. If we go a little bit more east, we do have those
So
laws.
what about Europe then?
What about Europe and what? So every country has, every single country is going to have its own laws and its own arguments about that. The most I know about is France and then Turkey, which is the bridge between East and West, often seen that way. And just the deep contrast between those two nations. Like, I think you should not wear a burqa when you're driving. I will go on tape and say that. Not because I'm trying to violate your religious freedom or whatever it is, your expression, because often this is not about religion. This is the other thing we haven't talked about. Plenty of women wear hijab because they feel like it protects them, number one. Might not even be a religious element. But anyway, I will happily go on tape and say, if you cannot see while driving because of anything on your head, you shouldn't drive. Like, that's fine. I'm fine with that. Because that's like an actual concern. But somebody wearing a hijab walking down the street who might be wearing it because there's this great book. It's called I Speak for Myself. It's a collection of essays by Muslim women, and each one is a different essay, and each one has a different perspective about why they veil or don't. And so many of those women say in that book, I don't do it for religious reasons. I do it for the anonymity of it because I don't want to be in the male gaze anymore. Seems like a valid reason to me to not want to be looked at, to be a little more invisible in this world. So that's like, even just that book, just the experience of reading those complicated notions of what this hijab might mean, or any veiling might mean to a woman. It doesn't always have to be religious.
But isn't that religious? The forced modesty?
No. I didn't say it was for modesty. I said it's because men constantly look at me, and I don't want to be looked at anymore. That's because of misogyny. That's not forced modesty. That's a desire for modesty because this world can't seem to understand how to deal with women's bodies. Two totally different things.
So I'm gonna take a break here and come back.
Is there a score? Is that the reason you're taking a break?
No, but I'd be more than happy to do that right now.
I mean, the Netherlands, whatever their law is right now, bad law.
Still 0-0.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I mean it's got to be almost done. It's just after half.
Wow.
So it didn't start at 11 then.
Okay.
Liars. Okay, all right. Anyway,
So
I wonder if anybody's wearing a hijab at the game.
Sure.
They want you on tape.
Sorry about that. Yeah, coming from Bangladesh as an immigrant, first of all, I'm an ex-Muslim. I used to be Muslim. I'm an atheist.
So I would much rather hear what you have to say about this than me then,
Yeah,
frankly.
when I came here,
really.
I did receive double-digit hate. The judge who saw me as my asylum application, he rejected my asylum case 3 times. First he said, wait a second, are you atheist enough to be an atheist? I mean, you married a Muslim woman. And I said, well, I mean, that's between 2 of us. We decided to marry because our religious differences.
Because the world is complicated.
Right. She
Right?
wears
Like-
hijab, and I respect her choices, and I never had any problem even with our daughter. She's 15. She covers herself. Because of the cultural part, I know she's not religious. That is
See that? Right, yeah.
But she's doing it for a different purpose, to respect the culture, because she sees a lot of people around us who cover their head. She goes to Princeton High School, and she's a very, open-minded person. But one thing I noticed that Pew Research, shows
Yeah,
that
Pew
Research shows atheists and Muslims are the most hated people in America.
Not
And I
surprising
said, oh,
to any of
Mr.
you in
Judge,
this room, probably.
no
Yeah.
wonder you denied my case 3 times. Although my asylum was granted after I lost like 4 or 5 friends in Bangladesh recently. I don't know if you heard about them. Atheist bloggers were killed. But 70% of Americans are still like religious, and only 30% consider themselves as none. That includes me also. American patriarchy is still up on the rise.
This is what we do in my classroom when we agree
So,
with things.
I mean,
It's
I
not-
could not be an atheist without being a feminist. The first
Oh my
prerequisite
God.
for me was...
Can you get a T-shirt made with that? That's amazing. Anyway, yes.
That's
go
a
ahead.
prerequisite for me. I knew that every religion...
Well, because that intersection, right, of marginalization,
Yeah.
I think, is what you're
So
speaking
I think
to.
the American patriarchy is up on the rise. This country never had a woman president. Look, Bangladesh, we already had 2 women prime minister, equivalent to president. So I'm always dubious about America's position about Muslim world. They wanted to make us look bad.
Come here and do the rest of this. Yeah.
And women should not look, good either. And veil becomes a big challenge for them. I think they use it as a tactic just to attack them, when veil is just the freedom of that individual choices.
You
and
have
preferences.
literally just defined my life's work. Because I started my Ph.D. in 2004, right? So it was pretty close to after 2001, and I was just trying to make sense of everything you just talked about. And I've been watching closely everything you just talked about. That's beautiful. I hope that you spoke clearly into that microphone, and that's on this tape, because I'm going to show that to my students.
Fantastic. Couple more.
Is that tactic engineered?
The
Or is that-
rhetorical tactic that I'm
Yes.
talking about?
Like how
I
engineered is it?
100%. So in my mind, and I'm not saying it's villainous. I'm just saying it's smart, if nothing else. It's playing into your audience, right? Good rhetoric speaks to your audience. And the Western audience is very, very dedicated to the idea of liberation and likes to convince themselves, though I know these 2 people will also disagree with me, the women in the U.S. are liberated and everything's fine. So in the much longer version of this, I go through what I think is perhaps the most interesting, but the longest, is Nancy Reagan. Oh my God, how old am I? Laura Bush's radio address for Thanksgiving right after the attacks. So about 2 months. That radio address is so laden with the idea of Western women having it great, and it is our obligation to free the women of Afghanistan. If you went back and like looked at it now, you'd be like, I can't even. This is so. Again, not villainous. It's just smart. It's just smart rhetoric, right? Smart rhetoric knows your audience.
Obviously engineered for that purpose.
Yes. And I gave this talk at Shepherd University, and I talked about her, and I talked about how that she was deployed in that way to kind of bring this like feminine touch to it, and they were mad. They were not having it.
What about the popularity of the books that you discussed today?
Yeah.
Was that driven by an
I think it is. I kind of do, right? Like, books don't just magically get published. Nicholas Kristof doesn't just magically find Mukhtar Mai. There's not like some wizard behind a curtain. I'm not saying that. I'm just like.
Well, I guess it'd be hard to determine the exact extent.
Correct.
But I just mean, in your opinion, you think
all
that
three of the books, the Najude book, even the Malala book, they're mediated through the West. They're written in English. Like, who is that for? It's not for. Pakistan, like, really dislikes. So the nation of Pakistan dislikes Mukhtar Mai, but she still lives there. The people of Pakistan do not like Malala Yousafzai. And part of this paper, in the footnotes, I'm talking all about how Yousafzai is not, like, praised and lauded in Pakistan. She is not some hero the way she is seen here. Why not? Because they feel like she is airing their dirty laundry, if I'm going to give you a very short answer. That is why the Pakistani government did not like Mukhtar Mai, and that was the argument that the government gave to her when they denied her passport or visa the first time. You are airing, this is not what they, but you're airing our dirty laundry. You're making us look bad. So yeah, it's not, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, man behind the curtain, Wizard of Oz thing. I just think it's people know their audience, and right, Malala's book sold like crazy and was the common reading for all these schools. And some of you probably read it or know somebody that read it. It sold like over 1 million copies already. Has a reading guide in the back. Like, it is a very popular book. Excuse me, for a reason.
Go back up.
One question I had, sorry, not used to speaking on a mic.
Neither am I.
Me.
I cannot wait to not be quiet. Yes.
Then I'll try to make my 10-part question brief.
I got all day. It's only second half. It's fine.
Veiling, I think, as you've explained it, is really, the oppression. It symbolizes oppression.
Good distinction. Yeah.
And I work with women who wear the hijab, and I've talked with women who actually wear the full burqa. And they
burqa?
actually,
like actual burqa.
In
like
Philadelphia,
burqa is
yeah,
the one with the screen in the front. Okay.
Full screen and everything.
In the U.S.? Because I very rarely see that.
Philadelphia,
okay.
there's
All right.
there are women who wear it. And,
yeah.
of course, in their home, they just dress normally. But they
take it off.
Find it, when you talk to them, they're like, yeah, I find it great. I don't have to think about what I'm going to wear. I just throw this on, and I go out.
There is, that is what tons of women say. It's liberatory.
My girlfriend spends,
a
half hour getting ready, and I spend 2 minutes, so that they do see it that way.
There are so many reasons that people use these things.
Yes. And it just seems to me that, like some people are like, oh, we want to get rid of the hijab and everything. And really, it's more about not being forced to wear it, and
right.
In our own culture and country, women were forced to wear dresses, right? And now that they don't have to.
In order for me to be deemed professional, right? I'm standing, I'm like, oh my God, my feet hurt, right? Yeah.
And even though they don't have to, many of them still do, right? Because now it's become a choice.
Yeah.
In our society, and that's really what we want for their society as well, is to get.
Well, and as you were talking, I was thinking about, I am obviously very wedded to the idea of liberation and freedom and democracy as well. I just think the conversation shouldn't be focusing on this like symbol of a veil, and maybe have a bigger, larger conversation.
Yeah.
I always when we talk about this, I always think about my flight to India. I was sitting next to a man who was living in the U.S. but was originally from India, and he was reading a book about how to have a successful marriage. And we ended up just chatting, and he was going to meet his arranged bride and bring her home. And we had this long conversation about, we just don't get it. Like, what is this weird, like, why do you spend all this time? You could spend 5 years with somebody and then not be with them. Like, it was such a great conversation because when I tell my students this and we talk about anything that we perceive as lack of choice, right? Everybody in the US gets so fired up. And this person that I was sitting next to, and there are women that I know who are also in marriages in this situation, find it liberating to not have to participate in this strange dating Tinder world, that we could probably really quickly get down to an argument that that's not liberating either for people. So I'm glad you bring that up, because the idea of freedom is very different for different people. And there's no one path to freedom. Oh, God. I'm going to turn the microphone off. Shut it down, Jason. Shut it down. I have a lot to say about that.
Just one comment. Growing up in the 40s and early 50s, women in the United States wouldn't go out of the house without a kerchief on. They didn't go, or they wore a hat to town. My aunt always wore white gloves and a hat to go to town. When you went to church, even if you weren't Catholic, you would wear something. Is it part of our secularized culture today, or just the style? That we have such an issue with the hijab. Did people at in those days have a problem with hijab, not the hijab, but the veil, like we do today?
Because that issue wasn't forced upon them.
Right.
Yeah, it would be fascinating, right, to know that.
That's
and
part of
and if we were kind of using that math, so it would be fascinating together in like 60 years and be like, why did any of you care about this, right? Like, why did any of you even have a conversation about this? Like, it might just be the same exact thing. Why was it such a big deal? But you're right. That's an excellent point about the idea of deference and deferral and covering, and again, enacted on women's bodies more than men. But we see this, although I guess I was thinking about Mennonites and Amish with hats. I was starting to think about examples with men too. That's the only one I can come up with other than the yarmulke.
If you see a picture of a baseball game or a football game in the 40s, you'll see every man has a hat on.
Interesting, yeah. I'm sure there is a really good dissertation out there on this. I don't know enough about it to talk about it. But it's a great observation that head covering was not that big of a question. But suddenly now it is. It's interesting that now it is.
Okay, thank you so much. I was just going to say, would anybody oppose if we wrapped up? Do you have a quick one, Gary?
We'll let it happen.
Is it a quick one?
Let it happen. It's okay.
All right,
yeah.
great.
The one that I can think of is, it might not be the correct cultural name, but the babushka scarf. I guess it's normally Russian or Polish.
The woman. You're the woman? Yeah.
But that's a couple things. One is it's a cultural norm, plus age, plus it could be either modesty or preference not to have to get ready for the day in a certain manner.
Look at you complicating, right? That's the point. That's what I want all of us to be doing, right? Like complicating our ideas about these things instead of like assuming it's one thing and one thing only. Now that one thing may be right sometimes, but it's not always right. I would love to, frankly, I don't know. I don't want to make this assertion, but a babushka sounds kind of nice, right? Like just go out and cover your hair and don't have to waste my energy thinking about that. Again, culturally and styly. I don't know if. See, yes, my hair. Forget it on a day like today. That was very short. Did a good job. You did a good job.
Okay.
U.S. up 1-0. That is a
All right.
great time to wrap
And on
it
that
up.
note,
Yeah.
I think we will end
Yes, thank
if
you,
no one
guys.
has objection. Thank you so much,
Of
Colleen.
course, Jason.
We really
Thanks
appreciate
all
you
for
coming.
being so thoughtful.